All right, welcome everybody. My name is Lara Kiswani. I am the director of AROC. On behalf of the Save Arab American Studies Coalition, I would like to welcome you all. While we gather virtually, we want to acknowledge that most of us are on stolen lands of the indigenous people of Turtle Island. We also acknowledge those who have been brought over against their will through forced labor to develop this land. This webinar is being live streamed on AROC's Facebook page. Please be sure to share the link that is being dropped in the chat with all your friends and community who are unable to join by Zoom due to limited capacity. We hope today's webinar will shed light on what we believe is one of the biggest state-level racial justice policy decisions of this moment: the fight for ethnic studies, Arab American studies, and Palestine in California curriculum. With the passage of AB 2016, the California State Assembly called for the creation of a state-approved high school ethnic studies model curriculum that school districts across the state could use towards the development of their respective districts' ethnic studies offerings. To complete this work, an ethnic studies model curriculum advisory committee of practitioners and scholars, two of whom are joining us today, was formed to oversee its creation. The committee and writers worked for 8 months to produce an over 550-page draft document. The committee's work was clearly defined and included a system to receive public feedback all along the way. In the 11th hour, the summer of 2019, right-wing backlash ensued, pressuring decision makers to undermine the work of the advisory committee, which is what brings us here today. The right-wing backlash of 2019 specifically targeted the inclusion of Arab American studies as an extension of the Asian American studies section. Led by pro-Israel interest groups, they succeeded in erasing Arab American studies. And as always, our communities organized and worked hand in hand with original writers, launched the Save Arab American Studies Coalition, understanding that the attack on Palestine was in effect an attack on ethnic studies. In response to our organizing, the California Department of Education later agreed to reinsert Arab American studies in Asian American studies in the ethnic studies model curriculum, but it since has failed on their promise. And instead, they not only have relegated a whitewashed Arab American lesson plan to an appendix alongside a pro-Israel Jewish lesson plan, but they have also gutted the entire curriculum, to the point that it no longer meets the standards, values, and pedagogy of ethnic studies. Doing so despite over 30,000 public comments, many from you all, demanding otherwise. Doing so perhaps resulting in them not even meeting the very mandate of AB 2016. Let me list a few examples of what CDE, in their own words, deemed to quote unquote controversial. One, the idea that racism is a social construct. They therefore have included a reference to a biological definition of race in the ethnic studies model curriculum. Second, the inclusion of a seated Congresswoman, Palestinian American Rashida Tlaib, listed as a significant figure. Third, the word Palestine. According to CDE, the Arab American lesson plan needs to adhere to very specific standards that include not using any terms not accepted by the US State Department. Would any community accept such colonial standards? But friends, the fight is not over. We now have until March 17th to demand that CDE change course. We will be sharing action items at the end of this webinar, and we look forward to having all of you join us to ensure that we protect and fight for all our students. After all, if CDE allows these right-wing groups to succeed in dictating the future of education in California, what precedent does that set for the rest of the country? We will be hearing from all of our speakers on what is at stake in this fight, and then have a short period of question and answer. First, I have the honor of introducing Angela Davis, who will be sharing her remarks. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Angela has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Angela's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, UC Berkeley, and most recently 15 years at UC Santa Cruz. She's the author of 10 books and has lectured throughout the US and as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. Her recent books include Abolition, Democracy, and Our Prison Obsolete, about the abolition of the prison industrial complex, a new edition of Narrative, the Life of Frederick Douglass, and a collection of essays entitled The Meaning of Freedom. Her most recent book of essays is called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Like many educators, Angela is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison industrial complex than to educational institution. Having helped popularize the notion of the prison industrial complex, she now urges audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Thank you so much for joining us, Angela. You are muted currently.
Of course. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for organizing this effort. And I think I'll begin by saying that as a former faculty member in ethnic studies at San Francisco State University, I feel deeply honored to have been invited to participate in this effort to emphasize the importance of teaching students in California how to critically engage with liberatory struggles, and specifically struggles that represent racism and colonialism as phenomena in our history that can be examined and investigated by scholars and can be effectively challenged by activists. More than 50 years after the establishment of the first Third World Studies program at San Francisco State, we are still engaged in an ongoing struggle for the field, which is now known as ethnic studies, an interdisciplinary field born of multiracial unity, hard-won gains, and tremendous sacrifice. We should recognize that students today are able to enroll in ethnic studies classes precisely because of the dedication of members of the Black Student Union and the multiracial Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State, who drew attention at that time to the low number of students and faculty of color and to the lack of education that was relevant to their experiences as students of color. The BSU and TWFL went on to lead the longest student strike in US history. The students' demands tied their on-campus education to the issues they and their families and home communities were facing, from racism and poverty to opposition to the US war on Vietnam. They all realized that all education should not necessarily be subordinated to the production of discipline-based expertise on relatively narrow issues, but that we needed to develop the capacity to think and act critically in relation to the conditions surrounding our collective lives. The demand for relevant education continues to remain at the heart of the fight for ethnic studies today. The campaign by the BSU and TWLF helped to establish the first College of Ethnic Studies and paved the way for students to demand similar programs all over the state and throughout the United States. And today, ethnic studies is an established interdisciplinary academic field with programs not only in colleges and universities across the country, but in K through 12 education as well. As is often the case when Black, Indigenous, people of color gain power, attacks on ethnic studies have plagued the field since its earliest days. These attacks have been vigorously and effectively opposed by student activists and organizers, as well as by professional academic associations. And of course, opponents complain that the corrective that ethnic studies offers amounts to special privileges for students of color, or encourages people of color to see themselves as victims. But I think if we've been following the development of these issues, we know these criticisms are without merit and that they completely miss the point. Today's fight to maintain the integrity of California's ethnic studies model curriculum is the next phase of the fight to defend ethnic studies, particularly against objections to the inclusion of content about Palestinian Americans in the Arab American Studies portion of the curriculum. As someone who has long supported the Palestinian people, I know that we cannot capitulate here. The field of ethnic studies is not complete without the inclusion of content related to Palestine, Palestinians, and Palestinian Americans. To attempt to erase Palestinians from the curriculum is to engage in an intellectual strategy that reiterates the non-recognition of Palestinians by the state of Israel and the political process that Israeli historian Ilan Pappé refers to as ethnic cleansing. And so I join all those who reaffirm ethnic studies' commitment to decolonization, internationalism, solidarity, and justice, and who believe in a just and robust curriculum that includes teaching about Palestine and issues confronting Palestinian Americans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I want to appreciate you joining us today and echoing in support of this very important fight. Next, I want to introduce Jason Ferreira. Jason is Associate Professor in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies within the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. His teaching and scholarship focus on the history of radicalism within and across communities of color. And currently he's working on the first social history of the multiracial struggle that culminated in what Angela just eloquently broke down, the Black Student Union Third World Liberation Front led student strike at San Francisco State, giving birth to not only the first Department of Black Studies, but also the College of Ethnic Studies in the nation. Please welcome Jason.
Thank you, Lara. First and foremost, I want to give respect and honor. With over 2,000 people on this webinar, there's a good bet that some of the veterans from the strike itself are here with us. And so I want to give a shout out to them and also acknowledge that even though I focus on the strike at state, in the fight for ethnic studies in California, there were many theaters of struggle, parallel campaigns for Chicano studies in Southern California that would culminate in El Plan de Santa Barbara in 1969. But what I want to do here is I want to start with the Black freedom struggle, and not because we've just entered Black History Month, but because without it, quite frankly, there would be no ethnic studies at SF State or elsewhere. You know, yesterday, February 1st, marks the 61st anniversary of the beginning of the historic sit-in movement, in which 4 Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sparked a direct action campaign against segregated lunch counters that would ultimately sweep the South and for that matter, the nation. And that spring, as Black students came together to found SNCC, Movement Elder Ella Baker delivered an important speech entitled Bigger Than a Hamburger, in which she explained, quote, "Youth are seeking to rid America of the scourge of racial segregation and discrimination, not only at lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. This feeling that they have a destined date with freedom is not limited to a drive for personal freedom for the Negro in the South, but is concerned with racial discrimination for the whole world and the human race," end quote. In saying it's bigger than a hamburger, Ms. Baker was calling attention to a higher objective, freedom, one expansive, deep, one that rippled out into quote unquote every aspect of public life, and one that encompassed, connected the local and the global. Now, others today are going to speak about the important impact of ethnic studies in the classroom, on scholastic benefits, of the powerful personal transformations our students experience as a result of ethnic studies. But the fight for ethnic studies, we should remember, was and is bigger than a syllabus. Of course, this is not to diminish desegregation of lunch counters or of classroom curricula, but instead to highlight that much, much more is at stake. So as much as there's a conversation in today's debate over classroom content and pedagogy, just as in 1968, the issue is fundamentally about politics and power, about whether we will continue to be a society that puts babies in cages, allows killer cops to walk the streets of our cities, or turns a blind eye to the health disparities that sentence Black and brown communities to COVID death, or supports authoritarian regimes and apartheid states across the globe, or to the continuance of settler colonialism on native land. Let there be no mistake, the stakes here are not academic. Genocidal war in Vietnam, organizing for Black liberation, a blossoming Chicano movement, they weren't academic in 1968 at San Francisco State either. Now, there's much I could share about this rich history of SF State. I've spent a lot of time working on researching this book and this era. But in the interest of time, I just want to highlight two central concepts to the movement that are especially relevant today in the struggle over the ethnic studies model curriculum: self-determination and solidarity, particularly as it relates to SWANA communities. First, self-determination. Throughout the strike, the BSU and the Third Liberation Front consistently framed the issue as one of educational self-determination. And this was a demand that reflected lessons learned over years of struggle with an institution that was fundamentally created and organized to perpetuate the status quo. At every juncture, there was resistance. As early as 1963, San Francisco State denied the importance of offering classes, say, in Black history, with one history professor suggesting that no contributions had ever been made by Black folk. Later, as Black students began to apply pressure, they suggested that perhaps individual classes could be offered by the largely white faculty in traditional departments, despite no one having expertise. Then, as Black consciousness flowered in the mid-60s, students put forward a proposal for Black studies, and the administration countered with the less controversial, let's call it Negro studies. And then later, during the strike, in all honesty, as Third World Studies was put forward, it was replaced with the less controversial sounding ethnic studies. In essence, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the same battle is taking place today. Who has the right to define what constitutes ethnic studies? Its content, its pedagogy, its objective. People with actual expertise, or those who fear the consequences of students engaged in an emancipatory education, which ultimately then leads to another question: who has the power to define? The watered down multicultural framework that is offered in this revised model curriculum is nothing more than a modern day manifestation of that same resistance, a subterfuge for maintaining the status quo. Those opposing the original ethnic studies model curriculum are in essence the very same social forces who opposed it 50 years ago. Let there be no mistake. At the time, conservatives sought to crush it, liberals sought to co-opt, stall, or water it down. And what the strike said is that if we can't get our education that we want and need, then you're not going to get the education you have either. The second theme is solidarity. Now, on the one hand, the Third World Liberation Front, made up of Black, Brown, Asian, and Native students, signaled a historic unity between communities of color. It was a solidarity solidified by both politics and personal relationships. But what I want to talk about or bring up here is that there are those who would argue that Arab Americans were not participants in the struggle for ethnic studies. It is important to recognize that just because Arab Americans or SWANA organizations may not have been formal members of the Third World Liberation Front is not to say that they weren't involved, part of the larger community that won the strike and ethnic studies itself. And I mean this in two ways. A little bit of history, quickly. As early as 1962, the Arab American Association organized on the San Francisco State campus. And while in the early days, a good number of its activities were social in nature, they also held annual commemorations of the Nakba every single May. By 1966, the Arab American Association began organizing more explicitly political events, film screenings on Algerian independence, and most notably a stream of speakers on the struggle for Palestinian self-determination. And it would be at this point that they would join with the Black Student Union, who themselves were just undergoing an important transformation from a Negro Student Association to the Black Student Union to join together to co-host events. And in fact, by spring of 1969, they were organizing Palestine Day together. Another important constituency on the campus was the Iranian Student Association. Throughout 1967, under the leadership of Khosrow Kalantari, the ISA engaged in activities to commemorate the US-sponsored coup of Mossadegh in Iran and subsequent installation of the repressive Shah. The ISA led numerous demonstrations at the Iranian consulate in downtown San Francisco, and marching alongside them, members of the Black Student Union. When Khosrow Kalantari was arrested later that fall in support of BSU members who were threatened with expulsion without any due process, he faced a deportation back to Iran. And it would be the BSU and the TWLF in 1968 who would join in a campaign to defend Kalantari and prevent his deportation, where he most assuredly would have been killed. So Swana communities were absolutely present from the beginning. They were a part of the network of relationships that would give birth to ethnic studies. Finally, I mean it in a second sense. Arab American studies forms a vital component of ethnic studies for yet another reason. Aside from historical participation, ethnic studies was born of, similar to what Ella Baker alluded to, an internationalist framework. It was reflected in the name of the coalition, the Third World Liberation Front. The vision encompassed not just communities of color within the United States, but equally those throughout the global South who struggled for self-determination against colonialism and racial oppression. So when the TWLF would state in the spring of 1968, quote, "We have decided to fuse ourselves with the masses of third world people, which are the majority of the world's people, to create through struggles a new humanity, a new humanism, a new world consciousness, and within that context, collectively control our own destinies." They were inherently including Arab Americans and especially Palestinians, okay? So when the strike settled in the spring of 1969, by way of closing this, Nesbitt Crutchfield of the BSU and the Third World Liberation Front was interviewed, and he concluded, quote, "The strike is over, but the struggle continues." Indeed, the fight today over a liberated ethnic studies model curriculum, over who has the power to determine what constitutes ethnic studies, and the inclusion of our brothers and sisters in Arab American studies is testament to this very fact. Self-determination, solidarity, especially of the internationalist and anti-imperialist variety, are still central to our fight and to winning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. That history is so important in how we understand what we're fighting for and what is at stake at the end of the day. Next, I want to introduce Jeff Duncan-Andrade. He's a professor of Latina Studies and Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. As a classroom teacher and school leader in East Oakland, California for the past 29 years, his pedagogy has been widely studied and acclaimed for producing uncommon levels of social and academic success for students. Jeff lectures around the world and has authored numerous journal articles and book chapters on effective practices in schools. Transformational work on the elements of effective teaching in schools his transformational work is recognized throughout the United States and as far abroad as New Zealand. His research interests and publications span the areas of youth wellness, trauma responsiveness, curriculum change, teacher development and retention, critical pedagogy, and cultural and ethnic studies. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm honored to be able to share palabra with you from Ohlone land. And I ask permission from my Ohlone ancestors and also from my own elders and ancestors to share some words with you today. And I want to just first pick up on some of the things that Angela and Jason said and just remind us of something that Malcolm X said once, which is of all the forms of study, the one that is most likely to reward your efforts is the study of history, because the truth is always lying there. And I think that those first two speakers sort of restated, right, in their words, what it was that Malcolm was trying to remind us and why ethnic studies is so important, because in that truth is freedom, and in that freedom is our wellness. And so I was asked to just say a little bit about the relationship between ethnic studies and wellness. And so I'll start by saying that I think one of the mistakes that people make in this conversation is thinking that ethnic studies is a curriculum. As Jason was saying, it's bigger than a syllabus, or that it's a project or a department or a some other sort of institutional framing. Ethnic studies is none of those things. It's a way of being in the world that foundationalizes wellness by focusing on the most vulnerable and wounded ones, their stories, their histories, their needs first. There's nothing in the work of ethnic studies that is about the exclusion of others. It's a choice to prioritize those that have been deprioritized, because if you don't, you won't. And if history teaches us anything, it's that. If we don't intentionally say that we are going to prioritize those that we have pushed to the margins from the very onset of this nation state, then we won't. King referred to this as the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And we keep talking about how we're going to address all these issues and saying that they're important to us as a community, as a nation, and yet there's simply no evidence to suggest that it's a priority unless we make it a priority. Ethnic studies makes it a priority, because what ethnic studies does is it says when the most vulnerable are well, then we can all be well. It's all of us or none of us. But ethnic studies makes a choice on where to start that project. Without explicitly making that choice, we default to the choice that has always been made, which is to center power and to center those who have the most while ignoring those who have the least. So ethnic studies is about shooting for an endpoint that is about truth-telling and wellness for all of us. There is nothing in the ethnic studies conversation that is disinterested in the wellness of all people, but it centers a conversation by saying that in order for all people to be well, we must keep the focus where it belongs, which is on those who are the most vulnerable in our communities. Ethnic studies is deeply humanizing for all people. It is medicine for all people. And at no time, certainly in my lifetime, has this country been in more need of medicine. We're in the middle of a global health pandemic. And here is ethnic studies being offered up as a pathway to begin to address so many of the structural and historical realities that have put us into this position. And if we make those decisions, then its ripple effect across every community in this nation is widely accepted across multiple fields. There isn't even a debate in the medical field, in neurobiology, in psychology, in social epidemiology, and in public health about how important an ethnic studies framework and project is to the wellness of the nation. Not to the wellness just of BIPOC folk, not to the wellness just of the most vulnerable, to the entire nation. So this is not a project that we can afford to put on the side burner, the back burner, or the margins if what we're committed to as a state and as a nation is to coming out of this health pandemic in a way where all of us can be healthy and well. BIPOC communities have every reason to be angry, and yet they continually stand on the front lines of justice with love and inclusiveness. That's what's so stunning to me, is that these are the very communities who, after having for 400 years, right, after being central to the only nation state in the history of the industrialized world to have committed 2 genocides, communities of color are still standing in and fighting for inclusiveness, fighting for folks to be coming to the table to learn from our histories, to learn from our stories, to learn from our truths as a way, not just to heal ourselves, but to heal a nation that is so deeply sick and twisted because it continues to duck, dodge, and deny the truth of its origins and its history. Ethnic studies is connected to wellness because it's connected to the project of truth-telling. I have 8-year-old boys. And I know that those boys cannot be well, not in my home, not in my community, not in this nation, and not in this world, unless we find the commitment to tell our babies the truth. This is what happened. This is how we got here. All come, y'all come listen to what happened. We don't have all the answers, but we do know what happened. And let the children hear that truth, and let us, as the stewards of our nation's children, by telling them the truth, not pretend that we have the answers to get us out of the conditions which we've created. What I do believe fundamentally, after 30 years in service of young people in my community in East Oakland and all over the world, is that there is something about young people that makes me supremely confident that if we finally find the courage, character, and commitment to tell children the truth, that they will begin to resolve some of the world's most pressing and seemingly intractable problems, beginning from that truth point. And so here we have entire communities who have for centuries been defiled, denigrated, and dismissed for continuing to love when they've been hated. And once again, we are standing here saying, we're opening the doors to anybody who's down to sit at the table and tell the truth as a pathway to freedom, justice, and wellness for everybody. And while I certainly, after 30 years, do not have that all figured out, and I am crystal clear as a father of twin boys that are 8 years old and a veteran teacher that there is no playbook here. But we can say with certainty that the creation of a plan rather than a playbook must begin with honesty and truth-telling. And that is the essence of what ethnic studies does. And that is why ethnic studies is so important for the wellness of this nation. I'm going to end by sharing in the chat box and then reading aloud, because I know not everybody has access to the chat. A working definition that our community of scholars has been trying to share out widely through the Ethnic Studies Project and our other work as a way to begin to a starting point of a conversation about what it would actually mean for us to engage in social, political, economic, and educational projects that are fundamentally committed to the wellness of every single young person in the nation. So it's in the chat box now, and I'm going to read it. So our definition of wellness is the harmonizing of mind, body, emotion, and spirit. It is cultivated and sustained through healthy relationships that are responsive to the lived experiences and the historical and material conditions that shape them. Community responsive wellness strengthens the sacred link between self-actualization and community actualization in 3 domains. The inner self, a strong sense of culture, identity, and agency. The interpersonal, a rootedness and commitment to showing empathy toward family, community, and peers. And interconnectedness, positive interrelatedness to ancestors, place, land, and the natural world. This grows ecosystems where people and communities experience place, power, purpose, awareness, resilience, empathy, hope, love, and joy. I want this for my sons, and I want it for every child in this nation. And it is my firm belief that ethnic studies is our best hope in schools for making sure that all of our children have access to that kind of wellness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for reminding us what it is we are fundamentally fighting for. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Nadine Naber. She is a professor in gender and women's studies at Global Asian Studies and interim director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She has co-authored and authored 5 books: Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics and Activism, Race and Arab Americans, Arab and Arab American Feminisms, The Color of Violence, and Towards the Sun. Nadine is the co-founder of Arab and Muslim American Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, the Arab American Cultural Center at UIC, and Mamas Activating Movements for Abolition and Solidarity, and Liberate Your Research. Please join me in welcoming Nadine.
Thank you so much, Lara. It's such an honor to be with you. And these are 3 hard acts to follow, but I'm humbled and honored to do so. So in the late 60s, when the Third World Liberation Front was fighting to establish ethnic studies, the US empire, whose condition for existence is colonialism, permanent war, and slavery, was expanding its imperialist agendas in the Arab region and growing its commitment to unconditional support for Israeli settler colonialism. Through this process, while institutionalized through media and policy, Arab immigrant communities became the enemy within. And to cement global anti-Arab racism, a European colonialist and Orientalist discourse had to ensure that Arab culture and religion would be from then on solidified as backwards and uncivilized, so that in the eyes of America, we could only be liberated or dominated by white middle-class patriarchal heroes. And with the Iranian Revolution, we became the Arab Muslim enemy. And the 1980s brought us the assassination of Palestinian American Alex Aoudeh in a bombing in Washington, D.C. It brought us Operation Boulder, when the FBI harassed and stifled the voices of Arab student activists, and the LA 8 case, when Palestinian Arab activists were treated like terrorists and put into deportation proceedings for enacting free speech, which revealed a court case, revealed a secret plan to intern Arab Americans. So as we have seen the growing US empire with wars on Iraq and so much more, Arab immigrant communities that necessitated the intimidation, harassment, repression, and vilification of Arab immigrants in the US, from attacks on activists from Zionist organizations to Clinton's racial profiling, deportation based on secret evidence, post 9/11 war of terror related surveillance, immigration bans, FBI raids, FBI entrapment of youth with mental disabilities, and the profiling of our communities, and so much more. And so when you think about how anti-Arab racism extends out, sustaining the global genocidal structures of US militarism, and then reverberates back on the bodies of Arab immigrant communities in the United States, consider the Bay Area high school teacher who told their Arab American student Ali, and that's a pseudonym after he raised his hand in the classroom, "Raise your other hand." And after he does, the teacher says to him, "That's how all of you should come here, with your hands up." And consider the white man who approached a college student who wears hijab walking on a campus hallway on her own and said to her, "Are you carrying a bomb in your bag?" These are the histories out of which the field of Arab American studies was formed. And I mean liberatory, transnational, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, critical Arab American and racial and ethnic studies. These histories explain why in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when a small population of Arab American studies scholars set out to form Arab American studies programs in the United States within the framework of ethnic studies, when we did not yet have funds or staff, we found homes in Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. In 2003, I was hired to start Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and began growing this program within APIA studies, with Guamean studies scholars like Vicente Diaz and Tina Delisle, Filipinx scholars like Sarita C. and Emily Lawson, Japanese American scholars like Scott Kurashige, and Hawaiian scholars, and the list goes on. The APIA studies program included Asian Arab American studies and taught curriculum about communities that come from Asian and Pacific Islander contexts, including the many Arab countries in Asia, whose experiences in the US are shaped by imperial war, settler colonialism, and struggles for self-determination. And in relationship with Native American studies, Latinx, and Black studies. At the University of Michigan, at the time, there was no question that APIA studies would be our first home. And this also explains why many Arab American scholars have landed jobs in Asian American studies, and why I have been teaching Arab American studies courses, including the course Arab and Asian Solidarities at the University of Illinois in an Asian American and Global Asian Studies program. And it logically flowed that I published one of my first journal articles in the Journal of Asian American Studies about the conjoining of Arab American and APIA activism after September 11th in the Bay Area through the notion, quote, "So our history doesn't become your future." A quote from Japanese American internment survivors and their children who are working to end anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism in the Bay Area. And this is also why universities across the US that host courses about racism post 9/11 treat anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism as dynamics spanning the Asian continent, and why some Asian American studies programs today, like the one at UIC where I teach, define their programs as focusing on US racial formations, including Islamophobia, New Orientalisms, and anti-Arab, South Asian, and anti-Muslim racisms. So especially after September 11th, the fields of Asian American and Arab American studies have grown together. Just look to the 2018 Amerasia Journal. All of the titles address Arab Americans, titles like Arab, Asian, and Muslim Feminist Descent by Carol Fudda. And in leading South Asian studies scholar Deepa Kumar's forthcoming book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, she writes that analyses of South Asian Muslim American experiences have grown comprehensively out of the field of Arab American studies. These histories affirm the conjoined knowledges of Asian American Pacific Islander, Arab American, Muslim American, and South Asian American studies. And it is more clear than ever that those reactionary groups trying to remove Arab American studies from ethnic studies curriculum are enacting what Edward Said taught us, that placing Palestine and Arabs outside of history is a core strategy of Orientalism, racism, and Zionism. And I hope everyone listening today will see such efforts to silence our histories and our stories for what they are: colonialist tactics of elimination, in continuity with the same efforts bent on displacing us from our lands and containing us with bans, secret prisons, bombs, home demolitions, and the repression of our movements. And I hope each and every one of us will be horrified and enraged enough to take up the campaign's call to action until students in California are granted an inclusive, liberatory ethnic studies education, and, like Jeff said, truth-telling and wellness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Situating the history of Arab American studies, but also the solidarity and interconnectedness of our movements, and also the history of 9/11 as it relates to that. And just would like to also name for all our listeners, there is a lesson plan in the current draft about 9/11 and discrimination against South Asians and Muslims, and it intentionally leaves out any mention of Arab, Arab American, Palestine, Iraq, or any of the countries that we're at war with after 9/11. I am excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Reshel Zhang, who is a professor and the previous chair of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He's written books on race and religion. And last year he co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, a project to document racism during COVID-19 and advocate for policy interventions. Thank you so much for joining us, Reshel.
Thanks, Laura. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Davis and that I'm on a lonely land, and acknowledge their clear presence, their past, the present, and their emerging leaders today in my spirit and around us. Jeff brought in his son, so I have to tell a family story too, because ethnic studies is about being family. And I can't help but, at the beginning of the pandemic, just before shelter in place, I went to a sporting goods store with my son. And so we got into the checkout line, and immediately the person in front of us saw that we were Asian and noticeably, deliberately moved away. And it was a clear shunning of us. And both of us recognized, wow, people are really seeing us as threatening, disease-carrying people. The next line over was an hour-long wait for ammunition. And it was a long line. And when you juxtapose, or when I juxtapose those two ideas together, I recognized my son was being seen as the enemy, and people were arming themselves against the enemy. So Nadine just talked about how certain racial groups are portrayed as enemies within. That is an expression of the Christian nationalism that we're seeing today. That's an expression of the Capitol insurrection, that America should be a white Christian nation, and those who are perceived as different, those who are seen as outsiders and foreigners, are clearly to be mass detained, mass deported, mass banned, mass incarcerated. So that experience led me to create Stop AAPI Hate. It was an advocacy group to document the racism against Asian Americans. And what we realized is that the best strategies that we could learn from, the best ethnic studies that we could draw upon, was the experience of Arab, Muslim, South Asian brothers and sisters who strategized after 9/11, that we've had a similar context of external foreign incidents relating, corresponding to the bashing of colonized people within the United States. And so actually Stop AAPI Hate was actually led through the wisdom of our Arab, Muslim, South Asian brothers and sisters, using the same strategies that they used to fight detention, profiling, deportation. And so Nadine talked about how Arab American studies came out of Asian American studies, but Asian American studies is now, and not Asian American studies, but the Asian American movement is now being profoundly shaped by and learning from the strategies and resistance of our brothers and sisters. So I just want to acknowledge that even when you think about East Asians and Chinese are primary targets of this anti-Asian racism, the leaders of our movement are mostly South Asian women. And so there is that intersectional third world solidarity that Jason talked about. It's all about the self-determination of our communities. I just want to reaffirm those values of wellness, self-determination, and solidarity. I just want to quickly talk about how we have in Asian American studies 3 statements reaffirming the inclusion of Arab American studies within Asian American studies, that we have a long co-history of fighting against the twin evils of racism and imperialism that Angela talked about, that those 2 twin evils continue to confront us and continue to be sort of the, should be the driving constructs of ethnic studies, not just multiculturalism or diversity or social justice, but the fight against racism and imperialism that's not only impacts people of color, but does impact whites as well. So to highlight why Arab American studies should be included in Asian American studies, I just want to read 3 statements from 3 groups of people that have been lobbying the California School Board and the legislature. The first was actually put out by the Third World Strikers themselves. This is a statement by 27 of the original strikers in the 1968 strikes at San Francisco State and at UC Berkeley. And they write, while the main protagonists within the TWF were African American, Asian Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, the spirit of the Third World Liberation Front encompassed all those struggling against racism and colonialism. Arab and Muslim activists participated in and expressed solidarity with the Third World Liberation Front strike. Both the Organization of Arab Students and the Iranian Student Association actively and unconditionally supported the goals of the strike in particular, and the goal of decolonizing the curriculum in general. OAS and ISA shared the BSU TWLF opposition to the Vietnam War with the same unequivocal commitment to opposing US intervention in the Middle East and elsewhere. So later on, we see the roots of Arab American studies as fundamentally part, like Jason said, based at San Francisco State in the liberation of both their international communities and locally. And as Nadine said, later on, scholars of Asian American studies, the chairs of Asian American studies, we wrote a letter to the commission arguing that Arab American studies has always been connected and integral to the Association of Asian American Studies. Like Nadine said, the Journal of Asian American Studies, a flagship journal for the Association of Asian American Studies, published a special issue on Asian Arab American Studies. UC Berkeley continues to offer classes in Arab American Studies through Asian American Studies. And we continue to partner with Arab American Studies because of, quote, our shared regional and social experiences, including one Orientalization as coined by the Palestinian American intellectual Edward Said, to the common discrimination and stereotyping as non-whites, as you've seen in the anti-Asian and the anti-Muslim Islamophobic racialization of our communities. And third, the colonization of our lands, cultures, and peoples. So we have both a common racialization, a common Orientalization, a common colonialization that we're all trying to oppose. And in seeking a relevant education in ethnic studies, a relevant education isn't for individuals. Like Jeff talked about, what we mean by a relevant education isn't one that's useful for your career as an individual. Relevant education means it's applicable to affect social change in our communities. That the original goal of ethnic studies wasn't about upward mobility or incorporation into the American empire, but rather it was actually to dismantle white supremacy and to undercut the empire so that we could actually have a nation that we would actually want to belong to. So to wrap up, UCLA Asian American Studies just wrote a letter of support. And I just want to read what this Asian American Studies faculty argued. We are unequivocal in our assessment that Arab American Studies has an important and central place in our field. Our department includes Arab American Studies and Palestine Studies in our teaching, pedagogy, and scholarly research. Any Asian American Pacific Islander Studies curriculum which does not include Arab American Studies is critically flawed and incomplete. Arab American histories and communities should not be relegated to an appendix and heavily repressed and censored. The erasure of Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian communities within the ethnic studies model curriculum enables and underwrites anti-Arab, Islamophobic, and anti-Palestinian racism and violence that impacts our communities. Instead, the model curriculum should foster critical pedagogy, which can challenge the ideological and structural forms of oppression all our communities experience. So I just want to stand in solidarity with the speakers before, that Asian American Studies throughout California are in support of the original curriculum, and we will continue to fight alongside our brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Russell, for that solidarity and reminding that it's about self-determination and for us to decide for ourselves how we tell our stories, where we tell our stories, who tells our stories. And the very fact that we have to make a case in this regard, in this fight for ethnic studies, is the problem in and of itself. Next, I want to introduce Andrew Gillivette. He's a professor and department chair of ethnic studies at UC San Diego, as well as the inaugural founding director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at UC San Diego. He's a former professor and department chair of American Indian Studies with affiliations in race and resistance studies, sexuality studies, and educational leadership at San Francisco State University. He is the author or editor of 9 books in print or forthcoming, including Arab American, Indian, and Indigenous Education for the 21st Century, Research Justice, Methodologies for Social Change. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew.
Yatowi Hokisakus, good afternoon, relatives. Indigenous stewardship, thrivance, and peoplehood are deeply interwoven into discussions of ethnic studies and our refusals as Indigenous, Black, Arab, and Asian peoples. As we fight to continue centering ethnic studies, we recognize our sacred responsibilities to move beyond the language of settlement and displacement. I come from the Tisiquip Huron clan of the Sunrise people of the Attakapaw Ishak of Southwest Louisiana, and from the West African peoples of Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, and Mali. We recognize ethnic studies as more than a project. Ethnic studies is tied to what my colleague Melissa Nelson identifies as original instructions. As Indigenous peoples and as ethnic communities experiencing histories of marginalization, in the United States and across the world based on our ethnic backgrounds, whether from the Ramaytush Ohlone territory where I speak to you today, or whether we're talking about Palestinian people and other Arab peoples, we recognize that our original teachings call on us to work across communities to form kinship bonds. Ethnic studies teaches us to challenge the simple ideas of allyship. Bishop Yvette Flunder from the City of Refuge in San Francisco has identified or talked about the fact that when we talk about allyship, it's very transactional. When we form an alliance, you do something for me, so I will later do something for you. Ethnic studies isn't about an allyship, right? It's about kinship. It's always been about that, and people have co-opted our language. And so I've really called for a suspension of things like allyship, accomplices, this language, right, to move to a different type of language, to shift to kinship, or what Cree scholar Sean Wilson refers to as relationality. How are we all connected? And that's an ongoing question we must ask within the context of ethnic studies, particularly when we acknowledge the ways that Arab peoples are racialized in many of the precise ways that American Indian and other folks of color are racialized and erased. So when we shift from frameworks and language that link our movements to solidarity, which again is about a transaction, instead to a framework that is linked to ceremony and kinship, we take back the tools we need to center our own genealogies and our own futures. By centering ceremony, kinship, and thrivance, rather than concepts like survivance or resiliency, we acknowledge our active presence and joy, not just our experiences with colonial trauma. I would also call on us to challenge the construct of settler colonialism to frame what transpired and what continues to take place across Indigenous communities globally as more than acts of settlement, displacement, or dispossession. We must really understand these acts as forms of terrorism and attempted cultural and political genocide, PTIS, post-traumatic invasion syndrome. This includes the ongoing terror and attacks against Palestinian self-determination in Israel and right here in this colonial state called the United States. Let's be honest about the origins of terrorism against Indigenous Black communities. Let's be honest about the kinship bonds we share as a result of these violences against our very bodies. The fight for ethnic studies and the inclusion of Arab American studies is literally a fight for our lives. This is a fight for our lives and for our futures. If we needed any reminder, let us look back to the 6th of January when we saw at the Capitol unchecked white terrorism coming home, right, to reveal itself. Let that have been any of our communities. And so as we fight to create more access to relevant and meaningful ethnic studies curricula, let us remember that the roots of ethnic studies is in the kinship that we share with one another through ethnicity, not Judeo-Christian religion, through the social construct of race placed onto our bodies, not Judeo-Christian religion. And what each of us continues to unmask when we do the work of ethnic studies, we unmask the terror regimes that exist in the United States and across the globe. We sit here today on stolen land. This must be the first lesson. Ethnic studies must always begin with Indigenous studies, so we never reify the same forms of displacement perpetrated by colonial terrorist regimes. In my community among the Ishak tribe, Wihokisakus, which I greeted you all with, means we are all related, relations, connected. For our people, the concept of kinship has always allowed us to not only, quote, survive, but to resist, to maintain, to do more than just be resilient, get punched in the face and just keep getting back up, telling us what we can and can't teach our young people. We're not asking, we are telling you, we are demanding our right to exist. We see Arab communities and Palestinian communities more specifically as our relatives. And so when we go to the water, we are going to be with relatives. When we are going to the land, we are making prayers, we are making medicine, we are remembering and giving thanks for the ability to live and sustain our communities because of everything that the land offers. We are continuing to be the ongoing stewards of this place today. And so I want to offer that ethnic studies also reminds us that we are medicine to one another. Ethnic studies is medicine to the students we teach and learn from. Ethnic studies is medicine to and from the communities that help to create this transformative field. I want to end by sharing concepts from Wihokisakus, this idea that we are all related, this indigenous thrivance model, and how this framework, when enacted in ethnic studies, can center indigeneity, peoplehood for all of our communities, centering the land and our relationship to it, centering justice, centering the kinship among Arab, Indigenous, Black, and Asian communities. So this model of thrivance includes 5 principles I want to leave you with. 1, understand the land you stand on and the land where you come from. 2, center the wisdom of the women and youth in your community, particularly in the abolitionist frameworks you use in and outside of the classroom. Ethnic studies isn't just about what we teach, it's how we teach. We have to transform these classroom spaces. 3rd, center ceremony. And I don't mean this in a religious context, right? When we talk about ceremony, it's about the kind of relationship, right? If we shift the way that we teach to think about it as ceremonial work, we remember and we recall our ancestors. So center ceremony and ethnic studies curriculum as wellness medicine. 4, foster relational accountability. We deeply believe that this is our responsibility to one another. And in that responsibility, we have a reciprocal relationship that we share. And we share this in a spatial rather than a temporal manner, meaning how our communities are connected. It's not by chronological events, but by connections and experiences of racial and ethnic kinship. Finally, center culture as medicine in a holistic rather than an isolated or additive manner. So again, the folks at the state level who are, to be blunt, yet again contributing to acts of terrorism and violence against our communities, we are speaking to you today. We are calling on you today. We are demanding of you today that you include our Arab American relatives. We stand with them. And this is not just about adding material. It is about radically transforming the way that we do this work. And so we are here to radically and forever change it. Hueyo, thank you, relatives.
Thank you so much, Andrew, reminding us that if we center indigeneity and kinship, we are then centering our shared experience, not only shared experience of racialization, but also our shared visions and political projects for the future and the liberation of all our people. I want to introduce Allyson Tintiangco-Cubales. She is a professor in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. She has worked with students, teachers, schools, and districts throughout the nation, including SF Unified School District, to co-develop ethnic studies, gender studies, social justice, and Filipino language curriculum. She co-founded several programs and organizations that have spearheaded the curriculum and pedagogical development of ethnic studies, including Pinoy Educational Partnership and Community Responsive Education. Please welcome Allyson.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you, everybody at AROC. I just want to shout you all out, and thank you, everybody, for joining us on this panel. I'll start by saying I often say, ethnic studies saved my life. I think some of you on this call may have heard me say it many, many times. 30 years ago, when I took my first ethnic studies class at Ohlone College on Ohlone land, I would have never guessed that I would be on this webinar today alongside these amazing colleagues, including Angela Davis, who has inspired all of us, many of us, and definitely myself. But here we are, fighting together for ethnic studies in the state of California, building on the work of our ancestors and with future generations in our hearts. This work to fight for genuine, critical, and transformative ethnic studies that presents the first-person narratives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color is not in vain. As an organizer who's been fighting for ethnic studies for the last 30 years, as a professor of ethnic studies for over 20 years, as the mother of an ethnic studies high school student, as one of the directors of an ethnic studies teacher pathway, as the advisor to many districts who are implementing ethnic studies as we speak, and as the former co-chair of the California's Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Board, I am outraged. I am outraged that some of the loudest voices being heard and the people who are making decisions about what ethnic studies should or should not be in the state of California have never even taken an ethnic studies class. Many of them have not been educators, and they are making decisions about what we are about to learn. I am outraged at the sidelining and undermining of ethnic studies teachers, scholars, and students, and the communities that we come from. I am outraged that in this process to develop a curriculum that really should have been about our voices at the center, a curriculum that should have been about completely abolishing white supremacy, a curriculum that should have been about our liberation, has now become watered down. So my outrage comes from all of that. But it is this outrage that I bring to you today, two actions that our community has decided to take. The first action, and this is a big deal for us. Those of us who are scholars, those of us who are in our communities know how hard it is for us to get recognized for the work that we do. But this first action is really speaking to that. We are writing a letter, which will be given to the CDE tomorrow. And this letter is from almost all of the former Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee board members and writers who have put decades of work to develop ethnic studies. This letter is demanding that our names be removed from the curriculum acknowledgements of the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. We were not fully consulted through the process of the curriculum development. Significant parts of the curriculum text do not reflect the work of past and present ethnic studies teachers and educators. And ethnic studies guiding principles, knowledge, frameworks, pedagogies, and community histories have been compromised due to political and media pressure. Our association with the final document is troubling because it not only reflects the ethnic studies curriculum that is problematic and that we do not believe in, but we do not see that this is worthy of California's students, our youth. So tomorrow, this letter will be delivered to the California Department of Education and publicly circulated. So the second action, and the second action comes from my heart and comes from all of our hearts who are working on it. It is a longer term project for many of us. It is a labor of love. It is the development of a liberated ethnic studies model curriculum coalition, led by some of the original ethnic studies model curriculum state level advisory board members and writers, along with a broad group of 50 writers who are scholars, teachers, practitioners, and students of ethnic studies. We have come together to build a robust ethnic studies model curriculum that centers the first person narratives of people of color. We have 6 chapters. Of course, we're going to have an introduction to ethnic studies, but we're going to tell many stories about that from different perspectives. We are also going to have a chapter on African American and Black studies. The 3rd chapter is Chicana XO American, also Latina XO studies, Asian American Pacific Islander, and yes, Arab American studies is included in the study of Asian Americans, specifically including lessons on Palestine. So I want to be clear about that's a choice that we made. Chapter 5 is American Indian and Native Studies, and chapter 6 is Comparative Ethnic Studies. In all of these chapters, we draw on pedagogies, not just content and curriculum, but pedagogies that center ourselves, and as Russell mentioned on this call, about our families. We also center our stories, as Jeff mentioned, about truth-telling. We also center critiques of systems that plagued our lives, like Nadine mentioned, critiquing the colonialist tactic of elimination. We also center our social movements of resistance that Jason and Angela taught us about today. And most importantly, our solidarity, and as Andrew put it, our kinship. And we do all of this for the wellness of our youth and communities. So I'll close by saying that we encourage the CDE and all of California's district schools and teachers to use this curriculum, the one that the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Group is creating. I encourage you all to reach out to longstanding ethnic studies scholars, teachers, students, organizations, and communities for support in your implementations. The one silver lining in all of this struggle is that we are not alone in our resistance. We've really built what Jeff and also Andrew, and then Russell, Nadine, Angela, Jason, Lara, myself, and Theresa is going to finish us off here. We've all built something, a solidarity that is rooted in love and hope. And this will continue to be our strength. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allyson, for showing what community organizing and power, solidarity, and kinship looks like. I'm going to hand it over to Theresa Montaño next, who's going to close us out with some action items. We want everybody to listen closely around what you can do to take action to be part of this fight to ensure that we protect all our communities. Theresa Montaño is a professor of Chicano Studies with an emphasis in education at CSU Northridge. She's also the co-chair of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition that Allyson just introduced us all to, and was a member of California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee. Theresa has more than 40 years in public education. She's taught for 15 years in K-12 schools before moving into higher ed. As an active unionist, Theresa is the former CTA vice president and active in the California Faculty Association. Her publications include 2 co-edited books, several publication essays, and curriculum units. Thank you so much, Theresa. You're muted, Theresa.
Allyson, it feels so good to hear it, and the kinship and the spirit and the unity and solidarity that Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum folks have developed. First of all, let me just say that none of us are shocked by the attacks on ethnic studies. The attacks on ethnic studies are not new. 1460 and the CSU ethnic studies requirement was the result of a ethnic studies task force that resulted after attacks on Cal State Long Beach and San Jose State. On my campus, it was Black students that were arrested and thrown out of school that led to the development of the largest ethnic studies departments in the country. I sit here because of warriors like Rudy Acuña, Jorge Garcia, and Mary Pardo. I sit here because high school students by the tens of thousands walked out in LA for ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is not a course or a discipline or great pedagogical practice, it is our life. And every single one of us who sat on that model curriculum advisory committee, who walked into that room, kind of checking out, well, let's see who's in here and let's see what we come up with. When we were skeptical and wondering, will the state of California really honor ethnic studies? Well, we were told exactly what the state of California was willing to do. And then true to their form, right-wing zealots who don't really care a hoot about communities of color exploit this time of public isolation, of community and student suffering, of increasing racial and economic disparity to undermine our movement for ethnic studies. That's not new. What is discouraging, though, is that the California Department of Education has chosen to bypass the expertise of ethnic studies experts and has given in to the pressures of white supremacist, right-wing, conservative organizations like Newbies Appropriating Ethnic Studies, Alliance for Constructivist Education, Educational Excellence in Ethnic Studies, the Hoover Institute, and yes, even the ADL. From a strictly educator standpoint, the revisions currently made to the original draft are substandard and insulting. For example, there's a new section called the Bridge section that gives these subtle directives and innuendos to ethnic studies educators to remind them over and over that ethnic studies is quote unquote for all students, and that ethnic studies is not intended to silence the other voices, implying that ethnic studies educator cannot center the perspectives, the questions, the needs, and the aspirations of racialized communities of color in a plausible and respectful manner. These zealots use our words against us. They insult our efforts to center BIPOC voices, to expose our historical and contemporary stories, the beauty of our culture, the story of our resilience, the exposing of our history, and yes, they even demean our efforts to engage all students in a liberatory project of unity, solidarity, and co-conspiracy in developing a better world. They align with right-wing political activists. Mind you, every single person on that ethnic studies model advisory committee was a person of color. This is a racist act against educators of color who came together to draft an ethnic studies curriculum. And when that happens, privileged voices rise, right? Right-wing and political lobbyists organize All Lives Matter campaign, attacking key components of the curriculum, from the Wall Street Journal, who attacked our critique of capitalism, to political lobbyists who attack our focus on racialized communities. Bret Hart added its voice to the chorus. They decontextualized our curriculum, and from that day forward, the CDE locked us out of the process. We were deliberate in our inclusion of Arab American studies. Not a single voice of dissent on that advisory committee. And to this day, we will argue that the failure to recognize Arab American studies is only caving into right-wing attacks. And it's an attempt to play the divide and conquer game. Well, if we leave the Chicano studies section alone, maybe they'll be happy. As practitioners who have devoted their careers to this field, we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop until ethnic studies, including Arab American studies, resumes its rightful place in the curriculum. The state's move to submit to these right-wing demagogues and political lobbyists, though, has emboldened the ethnic studies movement. It has made us more collective, tighter, if we could ever be, built the movement for solidarity because we were universally critical of their curriculum as it stands today. And like Allyson said, we said to ourselves, well, if the state of California isn't going to let us finish our curriculum, we'll come together and we'll finish it and we'll co-construct it and we'll continue to push and we'll continue to hope and we'll continue to lobby because we know that over 75% of the state of California's BIPOC students are looking forward to an authentic ethnic studies curriculum. And we'll continue to hope that the CDE and the School Board Association will begin to say, well, maybe they do know what they're talking about. And like our predecessors before us, as anti-racist, anti-colonial, and liberatory activists, we'll continue to mobilize until our voices and our stories and our dynamic, ever-changing disciplines are authentically recognized in California ethnic studies. And we encourage you to join us, And I do believe we're going to show you how you can join us in just 2 seconds. There we go. We continue to join us, sign our petition. If you're an educator, sign on to our educator letter. Tell your local representatives that you want authentic ethnic studies, that they can develop their multicultural US history course. We're okay with that, but do it elsewhere. Give us authentic ethnic studies like you promised us in AB 2016. Get your organizations to sign a letter in defense of ethnic studies. Take a solidarity selfie saying defend ethnic studies and join our next webinar. Our allies will be, there is a petition. Our allies will also be hosting a webinar, and that'll go up in just a few minutes. We encourage you, if you have other questions, please join that as well. And thank you for being with us today. We are all in this together.
Thank you so much, Theresa, and thank you to all our speakers. Unfortunately, we did not have time for Q&A today, but I'm sure this is just the beginning. We have more work to do together. This was so nourishing and inspiring. I hope all of you feel as inspired as I do to get involved and be active in the coming days. The link tree with all the ways to take action that Theresa has mentioned will be shared with you. You will get it if you have registered, share with your friends and family. We will be in touch in the coming days. And thank you again to Angela, Theresa, Jason, Jeff, Nadine, Allyson, Russell, and Andrew, and all the people behind the scenes helping to make this event possible. We hope you all have a good night and good afternoon.